to have been a much larger civilization that had since dwindled due to poor management of the island's resources. A narrative took hold of the so-called Easter Island collapse. But today, archaeologists are working to debunk this misguided theory. We recently hosted a virtual press briefing with members of the media to discuss the latest research about Easter Island and why the evidence suggests a much more nuanced understanding of the history of its people. Newswise COO Tom Canalichia will introduce our guests and moderate the briefing.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Lipo and ask the first question. If you would kind of give us all a quick introduction to Easter Island.
Easter Island, or as it's known by the people who live there, Rapa Nui, is an island that is really full of surprises. It's full of surprises today. If you go there, you'll encounter a population living in the island that are descended from ancient people who got there many centuries ago. But it was a surprise to the first Europeans that arrived there in the 17th century. It's an island that's thousands of miles away from the coast of South America, thousands of miles away from any other speck of land, Tahiti, the Austral Islands, etc. And it's very tiny. It's only about 14 by 7 miles across. It's a very isolated island, really out in the remote part of the Eastern Pacific. The island, the part of the surprise there is that first people were living on the island, and that was quite a surprise to Jacob Roggeveen, the Dutch captain who first arrived there in 1722, and to all the other Europeans that arrived there as well. But what they found, not only were there people there, but gigantic statues. Nearly 1,000 of these colossal monuments known as Moai are found across the island. And what makes this surprising is that when Europeans got there, there were people living on the island, but not that many, just a couple of thousand people. But yet these hundreds and hundreds of these statues, the sort of incongruity of what people were seeing there and the archaeological record that they encountered really led people to wonder, how did this happen? How did this occur? And a lot of the assumptions that Europeans made at the time was the fact that there must have been a lot more people living on the island at one point, because from their perspective, it would have taken thousands and thousands of people in order to construct and move these gigantic monuments. So one of the questions we were starting to ask is, well, was this really true? Were there really that many people on the island? Could the island support many thousands of people? This narrative has gone into sort of a reconstruction where people assume that there must have been maybe tens of thousands of people on the island, and that at some point in the past, that population collapsed, leading to sort of a destroyed environment with very few people. We really wanted to look at that story in detail, to look at the evidence that supported whether the island could, in fact, support such large people. So this surprising island really still invites a lot of new investigations to figure out what happened there.
We have a question here in the chat from Yuichiro. He asked, the story of the population collapse is a bit biased toward Western points of view, and could you please share your thoughts on the background of that controversy?
We're actually finding that populations lived on the island quite sustainably. It certainly was never an easy place to live, but people were able to figure out means of doing so and lived within the boundaries of the capacity of the island up until European arrival. And what Europeans are seeing actually initially when they first get there is a very sustainable population living within what the resources they had available, and that what happens afterwards is a consequence of European introduction of diseases and other kinds of things that take place.
Yuichiro also asks his or her understanding there is a report that the first Europeans witnessed rich vegetation in the island like bananas or potatoes. How do you take that into account?
That's a great point. So Jacob Roggeveen in particular, when he's sailing off from visiting the island, the first European there, he writes in his log that Easter Island or Rapa Nui could be an earthly paradise, that, a bit of tending to it, that it could provide lots of resources. Indeed, the earliest visitors were gifted bananas, chickens, and other kinds of resources to the Europeans when they arrived there. And of course, as sailors, they're looking for those kinds of resources. A lot of that sort of early abundance and sort of the welfare, the healthiness and sort of the vitality of the island gets forgotten later on in historic times when people start to encounter a population that's been deeply impacted by disease, slave raiding, whalers that are taking resources off the island, etc. So the story becomes much, much darker over the next 100 years, and it sort of tinges our sort of modern day understanding of the island. I guess this is a figure of the distribution of mulch gardening. So our study was basically an empirical one to look at in detail the patterning of this rock mulch gardening across the island. Previous studies had estimated that the island was fairly covered with mulch gardening, which led to estimates of up to 16,000 people. And we weren't sure that this was correct. One of the things we've learned about Rapa Nui is that there are a lot of stories and a lot of sort of narratives that people have and assumptions about the nature of the island. And what the island really requires is a detailed empirical study where you actually go there and look yourself to figure out what's actually there. In our analysis, which uses satellite imagery, shortwave infrared from a satellite, demonstrated that, in fact, those estimates of rock mulch gardening were vastly overestimated, and that it was much smaller. And then when our calculations in terms of how much food those could produce really is what we ended up with, a population of about 3,000.
Hear from Jennifer at Ars Technica. She asks, how does this build on your prior research, especially the 2020 study that you did in terms of accumulating evidence about this counter Easter Island collapse hypothesis?
Each study that we do, sort of looking at details in terms of locations of freshwater, which was part of 2020, looking at the chronologies, exactly when statues were ahu, these platforms were being constructed, when did they stop being constructed, and now looking at the spatial distribution of mulch gardening really provides different pieces of the puzzle that go into understanding the overall chronology and settlement patterns of the island. We're of course, our narrative, sort of our understanding of this is evolving over time. And it runs counter to a lot of sort of commonsensical and current themes. But we want to do that in a very empirically grounded way. So we really need to, everything we want to claim, we want to make sure that we have the empirical basis to make that claim so that we're not stuck with the idea that, well, we just said that was true. We really wanted to show that, in fact, indeed it is. So this piece really builds on that to really understand the limits of the terrestrial food production in combination to other resources that islanders use, which in particular, another area of our focus is freshwater, drinking water for communities.
Follow-up question from Yuichiro. It seems that your paper and other articles have conceded that maybe deforestation was a factor to a certain extent. And
certainly.
He's curious to know to what level do you think that was part of it? So,
one of the interesting aspects about the collapse narrative is the argument that which is true, that there wasn't a forest on the island. There were trees that covered the island in some combination. We don't know exactly the nature of the forest, but certainly from the pollen evidence and other kinds of fossil evidence, we know that the island had a lot of trees at one point prior to the humans arriving there, and that over time, once humans get there, the forest disappears, and that by the time Europeans arrive, there's vegetation. There's probably palm trees. We do get European accounts of some palm trees, but basically the island's deforested from what it used to be. Now, the assumption, from a European perspective, is the loss of that vegetation was an ecological catastrophe, that once you lose the trees, you lose lots of valuable resources, soil, things that protect the soil from erosion. You lose a lot of the ability to support the populations there. And that was what sort of triggered this downfall of the population, this loss of the forest. But what we found is that the trees themselves don't seem to have a strong economic value that would have led them to be a key resource for population survival. These are palm trees, which do not you can't make them into canoes, long-distance voyaging canoes or fishing canoes. They don't have, while they produce palm nuts, there's also, the Polynesians introduced tree rats, which ate the palm nuts. So they don't seem to have a strong key dimension to the survival of the communities on the island. Instead, they're actually a barrier to the ways in which people actually were able to produce food for their survival, which is clearing the forest to enable to grow sweet potatoes. So in fact, the loss of the forest is likely a transformation of the island from something that couldn't support many people into something that was able to support this 3,000 population, 3,000 people on the island. The opposite is true from what is typically claimed, that the loss of the forest is actually a transformation into a human supporting landscape.
Follow-up question. We have Alana Bouvard from Le Blob and Science Actualité. So her question, lots of history does suggest that it's Europeans that caused the decimation of the Rapa Nui, and rather than this so-called ecological collapse. In light of contemporary accounts of that being a factor, why do you think that this ecological collapse narrative still prevailed?
populations, we don't see demographic change, sort of decline in populations prior to Europeans' arrival. I mean, all the evidence, which includes genetics, archaeological, chronological, shows a continuous growth of populations until some sort of plateau is reached where the island is basically supporting the populations it's going to provide. We see a decline in things after Europeans arrive. And certainly that's a function of the things that Europeans bring with them, particularly disease, but all the other disruptions that go along with European arrival. So that's pretty clear. And we can look at the historic evidence, the historic accounts, the census, and see the decline of people over the period of time. We can actually see the falling of statues that were once standing fall over the time, all after the arrival of Europeans. So we can really see this falling apart of the island in a historic fashion, which is really the actual collapse of the island per se. I think this has become more and more accepted. People have had to give up a lot of their assumptions about what must have happened in pre-contact times and really look at the archaeological evidence. But over time, people have started to accept that. But yet the ecological story still persists. And we see that a lot in ecologists. One of the things that inspired us to do this particular study is the fact that ecologists often continue to use Rapa Nui as a case study for collapse and sort of ecological failure. And they use it in modeling and they use it for policy setting over and over again, which we think is really misguided. That Easter Island is a great case of how populations adapt to limited resources on a very finite place, and how they did so sustainably. We don't think it's a good model to be used as an example of collapse that then we apply to other places around the world or even our own future, that we can't use this island. And there are many cases in which we can look at collapse, but Easter Island or Rapa Nui is not one of them. And I think that's really an important factor that gives credit to the Rapa Nui people, their ancestors, and sort of the ingenuity they had for surviving on this island. And it points to places, if we're going to understand collapse in those narratives, let's make sure it's at places where this actually occurred so that we can draw meaningful understanding that we can then apply to our own future.
Another question from Yuichiro from Kyoto News. Do you think that the 80% accuracy of the AI judgments is high enough, taking into account the uncertainty that stems from this method? How did you come to that number?
That's a great question. Like all these studies, there's always an error term attached to them. 80% accuracy suggests that we need to continue to do more sampling and more measurements and more evaluation. But it's large enough to, the evidence that we got really pointed to the fact that the initial estimates about the land surface use was really overblown, and that we were finding very consistently a much smaller subset of the island being dedicated to this rock mulch. So like all things in archaeology, each finding is a stepping stone towards a continuous reevaluation of the evidence that will continue to do additional studies, bringing in, for example, higher resolution imagery, using sort of low elevation drones with different kinds of sensors, looking forward to new kinds of satellites that are out there, which will enable us to continue to dial in exactly the distribution of rock mulch. But the important thing here is that the order of magnitude that was estimated before was really greatly exaggerated, and it's much smaller.
Why do you think that this is important in terms of deconstructing and decolonizing our sense of history, where these sorts of maybe knee-jerk reactions of European colonial people making these stories to fit their narrative? Why is it important to do that today?
I think there's a lot to learn about human survival and human existence by studying the past. I mean, we often think the past is sort of this quaint story about things that happened that are no longer relevant. But when we look at sort of the history of humans, I think it's important to recognize that the successes of what people did in the past are really what led us to be here today and be able to even do these kinds of studies, and that we have a lot to learn from them. So I think there's a lot of surprising things to learn from them that we need to be able to look at in their own right, in their own context, by looking at the details. When we bring our preconceptions from the present and apply them to the past, we're really not learning anything. We're just taking our sort of assumptions about the way the world is and then plastering them on the past, which I don't think does justice to the array of ingenuity, the array of variability, the different ideas that were actually expressed by our ancestors. They were able to figure things out in ways that aren't going to be obvious to us, with living in constraints that were certainly more serious than many of the things that we face today. I mean, an island like this, 14 by 7 miles, without any alternatives there, they had to figure out how to survive every single day, producing food and getting water and the other resources they needed despite the fact there were simply no other alternatives for them to turn to when things got tough. I think there's a lot to learn about how they did that. And those lessons, I think, are important for us to understand so that we can apply them to the future. The way in which the communities were organized, the way in which they cooperated as well as competed with one another, I think are important ingredients for how people can survive in a limited landscape with very limited options. They're counterintuitive, which I think really points to the fact that they're counterintuitive because they're not aligned with our assumptions about the way things have to be. We often assume there must be large top-down organization telling people what to do. But in fact, community-scale organizations, small-scale groups working together can produce very stable and valuable solutions to really tough problems, like living on an island that's so remote and so isolated.
And with that, I will say thank you to everyone for joining today. Thank you, Dr. Lipo, for joining us to talk about your work and very, very interesting, fascinating story. Thank you so much.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.